The wind carried salt and the smell of wet concrete across the cliffs of Pas-de-Calais. March 1944. The Atlantic Wall stretched like a concrete scar across Hitler's Europe. 15,000 bunkers, gun emplacements, tank traps, and minefields spanning from Norway to the Spanish border. 2 years of construction. Millions of tons of steel and concrete. The Führer's proclamation echoed in every Nazi propaganda broadcast: "Fortress Europe is impenetrable." But Captain James Holloway didn't believe in impenetrable. He stood in a cramped basement office beneath the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in London, surrounded by reconnaissance photographs that covered every inch of wall space. Black and white images of bunkers, artillery positions, beach obstacles. The room smelled of cigarette smoke, ink, and the musty scent of classified documents that never saw daylight. Holloway was 32, a civil engineer from Pittsburgh who'd spent the Depression building bridges across the Allegheny. He had the kind of mind that saw stress points where others saw solid structures. He'd enlisted in 1942, and by early 1944, he'd become the man nobody wanted to disappoint, the engineer tasked with finding weaknesses in Hitler's coastal fortress before hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers threw themselves against it. "It's suicide," Colonel Morrison said from the doorway, his voice flat and heavy. He was holding another stack of aerial photographs from RAF reconnaissance flights. "Every mile of that coastline is fortified. Rommel's been reinforcing it personally since January. Artillery, machine gun nests, underwater obstacles. The beaches are killing zones." Holloway didn't look up from the photograph in his hands. It showed a section of beach near Omaha, a stretch of sand that would later be remembered for blood and bodies. But right now, it was just a puzzle. "There's always a weakness," Holloway said quietly. "Not in concrete this thick." Morrison dropped the photos onto the desk. "We've got reports from the French resistance. Some of those bunkers have walls 6 feet thick, reinforced with steel. They're built to withstand naval bombardment." Holloway finally looked up. His eyes were tired but focused. "Every structure has a weakness, Colonel. Every single one. The question isn't whether it exists, it's whether we can find it before June." Because June was the deadline. June was when Operation Overlord would launch. June was when those beaches would either become the gateway to liberation or the graveyard of the Allied cause. Holloway had been studying the Atlantic Wall for 4 months. Every photograph, every intelligence report, every captured German document about concrete composition, rebar placement, firing angles. He'd interviewed French resistance fighters who'd worked as forced laborers on the construction. He'd analyzed German military doctrine, engineering manuals, construction schedules. And slowly, impossibly, he'd started to see something the Germans had missed. "There's a pattern," he said, pulling out a map marked with red circles. "Look at the spacing between bunkers. Look at the angles of fire. Look at where they placed the artillery." Morrison leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" "A system that's designed to cover the obvious landing zones. Calais, Boulogne, the ports." Holloway's finger traced the coastline. "Rommel assumed we'd need a port. He assumed we'd attack where the defenses are strongest because that's where the strategic value is." That's sound military thinking. It's also predictable. Holloway pulled out another photograph, this one showing a quieter stretch of Norman coastline. "What if we don't need a port? What if we bring our own?" Morrison stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "The Mulberry Harbors. The artificial ports they're building in secret." Holloway's voice picked up intensity. "If we can land on beaches the Germans consider secondary, beaches they fortified but not as heavily, we might slip through before they can reinforce." "Might isn't good enough, Captain. We need certainty." "There is no certainty in war, sir. But there's probability. And I'm telling you," Holloway tapped the photograph, "there are gaps. The Atlantic Wall isn't a wall. It's a series of strong points with spaces between them. And in those spaces, there's opportunity. The room fell silent except for the distant rumble of London traffic above them. Morrison studied the younger man's face, seeing the conviction there, the dangerous kind of confidence that either wins wars or gets men killed. "Show me," Morrison said finally. "Show me these gaps." Holloway spread out a larger map across the table, a composite of dozens of reconnaissance flights, resistance reports, and captured documents. His hands moved quickly, marking positions, drawing sight lines, calculating fields of fire. "The Germans built this like engineers, not like soldiers," he explained. "They focused on structural integrity, on making each position individually strong. But they didn't integrate the system properly. Look here," he pointed to a section of beach near Vierville. "There's a blind spot. The bunker on the western edge can't cover this approach because of the topography. And the eastern position is angled to cover the beach exit, not the water approach. So there's a gap in coverage? A small one. Maybe 60 yards. But 60 yards of beach where the machine guns can't create crossfire, that's 60 yards where men might survive the initial landing." Morrison's expression darkened. "Might survive? You're asking me to send thousands of men into might survive?" Holloway met his eyes. "I'm asking you to give them a chance. Because if we hit Calais like the Germans expect, it won't be might survive. It'll be certain death. At least this way, we're attacking where they're weaker, not where they're strongest." Outside, the air raid sirens began their nightly wail. Another German bombing raid approaching London. The lights in the basement office flickered but held. Holloway didn't even flinch. He'd grown used to the blitz, to the constant reminder that this war was real and close and deadly. Morrison gathered the photographs slowly, his mind clearly racing through scenarios and consequences. "You're betting the invasion on a blueprint. On your analysis of photographs and reports." "I'm betting it on evidence, sir. On mathematics and physics and engineering principles that don't lie. Men do. Photographs can be misleading. The Germans could have reinforced these positions since we took these pictures." "They could have," Holloway admitted. "But I don't think they did. Because I've been tracking their construction patterns, their supply shipments, their troop movements. And everything indicates they're still focused on Calais. They still believe we're coming there." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Eisenhower needs to see this. Tonight." Holloway felt his heart rate spike. Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander. The man who would ultimately decide where and when to launch the largest amphibious invasion in human history. "I need more time to prepare." "There is no more time." Morrison headed for the door. "If your blueprint is going to paralyze Hitler's Atlantic Wall, we need to act on it now, before the Germans figure out what we've figured out." The door closed, leaving Holloway alone with his maps and photographs and the terrible weight of responsibility. Somewhere across the channel, German soldiers were manning those bunkers, confident in their concrete fortress. They didn't know that in a basement in London, an engineer from Pittsburgh had found the cracks in their armor. The question was whether those cracks were wide enough to save lives, or just wide enough to create false hope. Holloway lit a cigarette with shaking hands and returned to his photographs, knowing that in the coming weeks, his blueprint would either be vindicated by history or drowned in blood on a Norman beach. The briefing room at Southwick House was packed with men who held the fate of nations in their hands. April 18, 1944. General Dwight Eisenhower sat at the head of the table, his face carved from concentration and the weight of impossible decisions. Around him, Admiral Bertram Ramsay, Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and a dozen other senior commanders whose names would define the war. And at the far end, clutching a portfolio of photographs and diagrams, Captain James Holloway tried to control his breathing. "Gentlemen," Eisenhower began, his Kansas accent cutting through the tension. "We've heard the projections. 10,000 casualties on the first day. Maybe more. The Atlantic Wall is formidable. But Captain Holloway here believes he's found something we've missed." "Captain." Holloway stood, his legs steadier than he expected. He'd rehearsed this 100 times in his head. Now it was real. "Sir, the Atlantic Wall is strong. But it's not uniform." He pinned his first photograph to the board, an aerial view of the Normandy coastline. "The Germans have concentrated their heaviest defenses at Calais and the major ports. That's where they expect us. But here," he pointed to a stretch between Utah and Omaha beaches, "the fortifications are thinner." "Thinner doesn't mean weak," Montgomery interrupted, his voice sharp. "We've seen the intelligence reports. Bunkers, artillery, minefields. It's still a killing zone." "It is, sir. But it's a killing zone with exploitable weaknesses." Holloway pulled out a detailed engineering diagram. "I've analyzed the firing angles of every identified gun position along this sector. The Germans built their bunkers to cover the most obvious approach vectors. But they made assumptions about where we'd land and how we'd attack." He traced sight lines across the diagram. "This bunker here, designated WN-62 by the Germans, has 6-foot concrete walls and houses an 88 mm gun. Formidable. But its firing port faces northwest, covering the main beach approach. It has limited traverse. If we land troops in this zone," he marked a section, "they're in the blind spot for approximately 40 seconds during the approach." 40 seconds to cross how much beach?" Eisenhower asked. 60 yards, sir. If they're moving fast." The room erupted in overlapping voices. 40 seconds. 60 yards. Under machine gun fire from other positions. It sounded like madness. Eisenhower raised his hand for silence. "Continue, Captain." Holloway felt sweat on his back but pushed forward. "It's not just one weakness, sir. It's systemic. The Germans built strong individual positions but failed to create integrated fields of fire across the entire defensive zone. I've identified 17 exploitable gaps along the proposed landing sectors. Not large gaps. We're talking about narrow windows of opportunity. But windows nonetheless." He pulled out another diagram, this one showing beach obstacles. The underwater defenses follow a similar pattern. The Germans placed obstacles to destroy landing craft at high tide. But if we land at low tide, 2 hours after dawn, most of these obstacles are exposed. Our engineers can clear lanes while under fire, yes, but at least they can see what they're clearing. Admiral Ramsey leaned forward. "You're proposing we launch the invasion at low tide? That means our men cross more exposed beach. More time under fire." "Yes, sir. But it also means we can navigate the obstacles instead of hitting them blind. It's a calculated trade-off." "Calculated by an engineer, not a soldier," Montgomery said coldly. "Those men crossing that extra beach distance will be slaughtered." Holloway felt anger flash through him but kept his voice level. "They'll be slaughtered either way, Field Marshal. The question is whether we give them a fighting chance or send them into the teeth of the strongest defenses. My analysis suggests the latter is suicide. The former is just extremely dangerous." A grim chuckle rippled through some of the commanders. Extremely dangerous. That was the understatement of the war. Eisenhower studied the diagrams in silence. The room waited. Finally, he spoke. "The problem, Captain, is that your analysis is based on photographs that are days or weeks old. The Germans could be reinforcing these exact positions as we speak. That's why we need current intelligence, sir. Fresh reconnaissance. We've been flying reconnaissance missions constantly. Aerial reconnaissance, yes. But I need ground-level intelligence. I need to know the exact thickness of those concrete walls, the precise angles of those gun ports, the quality of the rebar reinforcement. Information that photographs can't provide. You're talking about sending men into occupied France to measure bunker walls? Montgomery's tone was incredulous. I'm talking about sending combat engineers to gather the specific data we need to exploit specific weaknesses. The French resistance has contacts among the forced labor crews. We can get detailed construction information. We can verify what I'm seeing in these photographs. Lee Mallory spoke up. And if your theory is wrong? If we commit to this landing plan and discover the gaps you've identified don't exist or have been closed? Holloway met his eyes. Then thousands of men die, sir. But they're going to die anyway if we attack Calais. At least this way, we're betting on intelligence and analysis instead of charging headfirst into the enemy's strongest point. The room fell into heavy silence. These men had commanded armies, made life-and-death decisions, carried the weight of nations. But this decision, where to land on D-Day, would echo through history forever. Eisenhower stood and walked to the map, studying the Norman coastline with the intensity of a man staring into his own future. Get your intelligence, Captain. You have 3 weeks. I want confirmation that these gaps exist. I want measurements, photographs, and verification from sources on the ground. If your blueprint checks out, we proceed with Normandy. If it doesn't... He didn't finish the sentence. Holloway nodded, feeling the burden settle onto his shoulders like physical weight. Yes, sir. I'll need authorization to coordinate with SOE and the resistance networks in France. You'll have it. Colonel Morrison will be your liaison. Eisenhower turned to face him directly. But understand this, Captain. If you're wrong, if those men hit those beaches and your gaps don't exist, history will remember your name for all the wrong reasons. I understand, sir. I hope you do. Eisenhower's expression softened slightly. Because right now, you're the man standing between us and disaster. Don't let the blueprint blind you to reality on the ground. The meeting adjourned, commanders filing out with their aides and adjutants, already shifting to implementation mode. Holloway remained, staring at his diagram spread across the table, feeling the magnitude of what he'd just set in motion. Colonel Morrison approached, his expression unreadable. You just volunteered to send commandos into France during the heaviest German occupation. You know that, right? I know. Some of them won't come back. I know that too. Morrison studied him for a long moment. You really believe in this blueprint? This analysis? Holloway thought about lying, about expressing absolute certainty. But Morrison deserved honesty. I believe the evidence points to exploitable weaknesses. I believe attacking Normandy gives us better odds than Calais. But do I know for certain? No. Nobody can know for certain until the first boat hits the beach. That's the most honest thing anyone said in this headquarters in months. Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. Come on. We've got 3 weeks to prove you're right. And if we're wrong, we'll at least have good company in hell. Outside Southwick House, the English countryside stretched green and peaceful under spring sunshine. Somewhere across that channel, German engineers were reinforcing bunkers, laying mines, positioning artillery. They had no idea that in a quiet English manor house, their entire defensive system had been dissected and analyzed by a man who understood that every fortress, no matter how strong, was built by human hands. And what human hands built, human minds could break. But first, they needed proof. May 12, 1944. 0200 hours. The French coast near Vierville-sur-Mer. Lieutenant Philippe Moreau pressed himself flat against the cold concrete, his heart hammering against the stone. German voices drifted from inside the bunker, casual conversation about a football match, a complaint about rations. Normal sounds from men who didn't know death was crouching 3 feet away. Moreau was French Special Forces, trained in Scotland, parachuted into occupied France with a mission that sounded insane when they'd briefed him. Get inside the Atlantic Wall defenses, measure the bunkers, and get out alive. He had a small team, 2 resistance fighters who knew the local terrain and a British combat engineer named Sergeant Davies who'd volunteered for this particular brand of suicide. They'd been observing this position, designated WN-62 by the Germans, for 6 hours. Watching patrol patterns. Counting guards. Waiting for the rotation at 0200 when the sentries would be tired and the relief crew not yet fully alert. That magical window of human fatigue where mistakes happen. Davies crawled up beside him, his movements practiced and silent. He was from Yorkshire, built like a barrel, with hands that could tear apart engines or German throats with equal efficiency. He whispered, "Guard change in 2 minutes. When they overlap at the entrance, that's our window." Moreau nodded. His mouth was dry. They'd rehearsed this, but rehearsals didn't include the real possibility of machine gun fire tearing through flesh. The bunker loomed above them, a concrete monstrosity with firing slits that stared out at the dark ocean like dead eyes. This was the strong point that protected the Omaha Beach sector. Inside, an 88mm gun, machine gun positions, ammunition stores, and 40 German soldiers who would shoot first and never bother with questions. "There," Davies hissed. Movement at the bunker entrance. The relief guards approaching, the tired sentries waiting to hand over. Voices raised in greeting. For 30 seconds, maybe 40, attention would be divided. Moreau moved. He crossed the 10 yards of exposed ground in a crouch, his rubber-soled boots silent on the grass. Behind him, Davies followed with the equipment pack, measuring tools, cameras, core sampling drill. If they were caught with this gear, there'd be no pretending to be lost civilians. This was espionage, plain and simple. Execution without trial. They reached the rear wall of the bunker, the blind side where the firing ports didn't cover. Moreau pulled out a small drill, modified to be nearly silent, powered by hand crank. Davies already had his measuring tape and notebook out. 6 feet, 2 inches, Davies whispered, measuring the wall thickness where a construction joint was visible. Reinforced with steel rebar, 10-inch spacing. Standard Wehrmacht specification. He was writing in the dark, his handwriting shaky but legible. Moreau drilled into the concrete, trying to keep the noise minimal. The bit pushed through slowly, too slowly. His arms burned. Sweat ran into his eyes. Inside the bunker, someone laughed at a joke he couldn't hear. The drill broke through. Davies measured the depth, checked the composition of the concrete by feel. Aggregate is local stone. Some river rock. Not optimal for structural integrity, they rushed this section. Probably built it in late 43 when Rommel was pushing for speed over quality. Will it hold against naval bombardment? Moreau whispered. The front walls will. This rear section. Davies tapped the concrete thoughtfully. Maybe. But it's weaker than they think. A direct hit from a battleship shell. I'd bet on the shell. They moved along the perimeter, taking measurements, photographs with a silent camera, noting details. The firing ports were exactly where Holloway's analysis had predicted. The blind spots existed, narrow gaps in coverage where landing craft might approach without taking direct fire from this position. But only if they came from the exact right angle. Only if the timing was perfect. Only if 1,000 other factors aligned. Got what we need, Davies finally whispered. Let's get out before. A shout from the bunker entrance. German. Sharp and commanding. They froze. Footsteps. Moving around the perimeter. A routine patrol they hadn't accounted for. The guard was walking their direction, rifle slung over his shoulder, probably bored, probably thinking about sleep. Moreau's hand went to his knife. Davies shook his head slightly, Killing the guard would alert the entire garrison. They needed to disappear like ghosts. The guard came around the corner, his flashlight sweeping the ground. He was young, maybe 20, with an unlined face that would never see old age. The beam of his flashlight passed within inches of Moreau's boot. The guard stopped. He'd seen something. A disturbance in the grass. A shadow that didn't belong. Time slowed. Moreau could see the exact moment of recognition in the young German's eyes, the realization that someone was there, someone who shouldn't be. The guard's mouth opened to shout. Moreau moved. His hand clamped over the guard's mouth, his knife finding the gap between ribs with practiced precision. The guard's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He struggled, but Moreau held firm, whispering in German, "Sure, sure. It's over." The light died in those young eyes. The body went limp. Davies helped lower the corpse silently to the ground. They dragged it into the shadows, arranging it to look like he'd sat down for a rest. It might buy them 10 minutes. Maybe 15. "Move," Moreau hissed. They ran. Not the careful stalk of infiltration, but the desperate sprint of men who know the alarm is about to sound. Across the exposed ground, into the hedgerow where the resistance fighters waited with the escape route mapped out. Behind them, someone shouted from the bunker. They'd found the guard. Or noticed he was missing. Either way, the machine guns would start searching the perimeter in seconds. Moreau and Davies dove into the drainage ditch just as floodlights blazed to life, turning night into artificial day. Machine gun fire raked the ground they'd crossed moments before, tracers streaking through the darkness like angry fireflies. The resistance fighters, Jean and Marie, a brother and sister who'd lost their parents to the Gestapo, led them through the darkness with practiced efficiency. Through fields, across a stream, into a barn where a hidden motorcycle waited. They didn't stop moving until dawn, when they reached a safe house 20 miles inland. Only then did Davies pull out his notebook, his hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline. "We got it," he said, spreading out the measurements and photographs. "Everything Holloway needs. Wall thickness, rebar spacing, firing angles, blind spots. It's all here." Moreau looked at the data that had cost a young German soldier his life. Was he right? The American engineer. Davies studied the numbers carefully. About the blind spots? Yes. About the structural weaknesses? Yes. About this being exploitable. He paused. If they land at exactly the right spots, at exactly the right tide, with exactly the right suppressing fire. Yes. It's possible. But not certain. Nothing in war is certain. Davies lit a cigarette with trembling hands. But it's better than attacking where the Germans are strongest. This way, at least they have a chance. The data was transmitted to London that night, encoded and sent via underground radio operators who risked their lives every time they pressed a transmit key. It arrived at Southwick House within hours, and by dawn on May 13th, Captain James Holloway was poring over measurements that confirmed his analysis. The gaps existed. The weaknesses were real. The Atlantic wall was strong, but not impenetrable. In his office, Holloway stared at the numbers and felt the weight of all those future lives pressing down on him. Somewhere in France, good men had risked, and taken, life to verify his theory. Now he had to trust that theory enough to send thousands more into hell. Colonel Morrison found him there at 0600. "Eisenhower wants your final assessment. Today." Holloway looked up, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "The blueprint is solid. The weaknesses are confirmed. If we hit Normandy at low tide, with proper fire support, targeting these specific gaps, we can get through." Can or will? Can war doesn't deal in certainties. Morrison nodded slowly. "Then that's what you tell Eisenhower. Because in 6 hours, he's going to ask you whether we should commit the invasion force to Normandy. And your answer is going to shape history." Holloway gathered his reports, his photographs, his measurements bought with blood. Somewhere across the channel, German engineers were confident in their concrete fortress. They had no idea that their walls had been measured, their angles calculated, their weaknesses catalogued by a man who understood that even the strongest fortress had cracks. The question was whether those cracks were wide enough to drive an army through, or just wide enough to become a tomb.